University of Virginia Center for Politics.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this special presentation brought to you by the University of Virginia Center for Politics. We're going to be taking a look forward to something that is important and is going to be happening tomorrow evening, 8 p.m., live broadcast of the hearings of the January 6th committee. And we have assembled a tremendous panel and moderator to give you some tips on what's going to happen and why, and maybe what you as the viewer should look for. It's often said that freedom isn't free. Compared to the armed forces, we average citizens pay just a small price for freedom. And the price is the obligation we have to vote, but also another obligation to keep up with current events, to keep up with important issues that affect the nation. And surely, what is going to happen in this January 6th committee is one of those. It involves the basic rights of fair and free and secure elections. On Thursday night at 8, as I mentioned, Congress will hold those live hearings beginning then. They're having a series of them in June about the attempted coup on January 6th, 2021. And that coup was all about unconstitutionally keeping President Trump in power and preventing President-elect Biden from taking the office he had fairly won. It's vital for all of us to understand what happened, not just on January 6th, but before January 6th, leading up to that terrible day. Who was responsible? How the efforts to undermine American confidence in their own elections and make them believe in this nonsense about vote fraud, how they continue to this day. And believe me, the people doing it, all of them, in elected, former elected, appointed office, and non-elective office, non-appointed office, just average citizens who are involved in this, they have the next presidential election in mind. We at the Center for Politics at UVA have assembled this terrific panel to prepare us for the Thursday night hearings, which will be aired live on all news networks, except, unfortunately, by Fox. They will not be airing the hearings on Fox News Channel. Let me introduce the evening's moderator. He's a great friend of the Center for Politics, a UVA graduate, a former student of mine from a number of years ago, and someone who actually in his position in 2020 actively protected the integrity of the 2020 election. Chris Krebs, and we owe, all of us owe Chris a debt of gratitude. Now, Chris is, as I mentioned, undergraduate at UVA, but he was a graduate of George Mason's Antonin Scalia Law School. Chris also served, importantly, as the director of the U.S. Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency, known as CISA, in the U.S. government that kept our 2020 election secure and safe. He's now a partner at the Krebs Stamos Group, a technology and geopolitical risk management consultancy. And Chris is going to introduce the rest of our distinguished panel. We thank all of them for joining us. And Chris, we thank you for moderating. So take it away, Chris.
Hey, Larry, thank you for that introduction, and good evening, everyone. And just before we get into this, I feel it's just from a transparency perspective, I should let everybody know I was interviewed by the committee, but as of right now, I have not been asked or invited to testify. So with that, let's get into it. We have a great panel tonight to discuss what we may expect in the coming weeks that'll start tomorrow. So our first panelist for the discussion is Paul Begala. Paul is a Democratic strategist who serves as a political contributor for CNN, appearing frequently on CNN's The Situation Room, as well as other programs on all CNN networks. And he just joined the Center for Politics as a scholar. So welcome, Paul.
Thanks, Chris.
Next, we have Josh Dawsey. Josh is a political enterprise and investigations reporter for the Washington Post. He joined the paper in 2017 and previously covered the White House. Before that, he covered the White House for Politico, and New York City Hall and New Jersey Governor Chris Christie for the Wall Street Journal. Josh received a BA in journalism from the University of South Carolina in 2012. Josh, my my niece goes to South Carolina and Columbia. So she's among good company, I guess. Next, we have Olivia Beavers. She's a congressional reporter for Politico. And over the last year, she has focused on covering House Republicans and GOP leadership, a beat that has coincided with a pivotal time for the party. And I've known Olivia for quite some time. She used to cover the cybersecurity beat when I was at DHS and CISA. So Olivia began reporting on Capitol Hill in late 2017 with the Hill newspaper. She covered various investigations like the House and Senate Russia probes, including working as the lead reporter covering the first impeachment of President Donald Trump. And yes, I had to qualify that, the first impeachment. Olivia is a University of Virginia graduate and former Center for Politics intern scholarship recipient. And Olivia got her start in Washington in 2016 as a news associate at CNN. Next, we have Tara Setmeyer. Tara is a former CNN political commentator, contributor to ABC News, and former GOP communications director on Capitol Hill. She's appeared on ABC's The View, ABC's Good Morning America, and HBO's Real Time with Bill Maher. She served as a Harvard Institute for Politics resident fellow. Also in January 2020, she joined the Lincoln Project as a senior advisor and hosts the live show The Breakdown alongside co-founder Rick Wilson on the organization's streaming channel, LPTV. Tara is also a Center for Politics scholar and here at UVA. All right, let's hop into it. So thanks everybody again for joining us. We've got a pretty stellar lineup here, and just setting some context, as Larry said, the first hearing starts tomorrow, broadcast in prime time, and reports suggest that there'll be a good chunk of new video material. So Josh, maybe just kind of, if you don't mind, I'll start with you. From a substance perspective, a content perspective, and I think Olivia can bring you into this one as well. What should we be expecting substantively? And what I want to hold, and Paul, I'll go to you and Tara next, kind of the strategy of this all, including some of the moves that the committee's made. So back, Josh, to start with you, maybe, substantively, what should we expect maybe tomorrow and in the coming weeks?
The committee is trying to put together a holistic and comprehensive report of the events that led up to January 6th and what happened that day. And what we're expected to see tomorrow night is kind of an overview of where they plan to go in the coming weeks. Some of the hearings will be in prime time, others will not be. But tomorrow night is expected to have some explosive video footage of that day, some in-depth analysis from folks who are behind the scenes with some of the far right figures, maybe in the Proud Boys and some of the others who descended on Washington, and some gripping testimony from folks who were under siege in the Capitol that day as well. I think the committee plans over the coming weeks to try and outline a smorgasbord of things, the pressure on Vice President Pence, the pressure on Department of Justice officials, how Trump allies work together with some of these fringe figures to perpetuate what happened on Jan 6. But tomorrow night is their first kind of foray into explaining to the general public why they should tune in. So I expect what you will see is kind of an overview of the case as they plan to present it, an open argument of sorts for the committee.
Okay. Yeah. So less about new material, more a bit about a highlight reel to pull people in. So Olivia, tip it over to you for your thoughts.
Well, actually, I think that we might see some new material. Nick Quested was embedded with the Proud Boys, and he's had some of the best footage that we've seen of Capitol Hill, including the breach of the barricades, getting into the Capitol. And so what we might be seeing is just sort of him being at the center of the violence and some of the stuff that unfolded that I think the committee is planning to just use as a way to help jog memories at a time when, we have some distance from when the attack happened. And there's this counter messaging that you're seeing from Trump and his allies on and off Capitol Hill that is saying, this is irrelevant. It's time to move on. We're going to tell the truth and talk, even in a closed door setting today, the top Republican in the House, Kevin McCarthy, was saying, let's focus on inflation. So Republicans are trying to do this sort of focus elsewhere approach. But this video is aimed to show just how dangerous, just how grave and potentially close these rioters came, and potentially what their timeline was in terms of coming together and storming the Capitol after the speech and the March from the Ellipse.
So let me ask the question, and Josh and Olivia, this one's for you, and then I'll shift over. Maybe the name of the committee itself, focusing on January 6th, is a bit myopic. So might also part of tomorrow be really setting out the scope a little bit more clearly. I mean, even whether it was over the weekend, I believe LA Times had one of those memos about seizing election equipment out in the states, which is obviously not about DC and January 6th, but it's about a broader campaign. And then you see members of the Proud Boys getting indicted with seditious conspiracy. So can you talk maybe a little bit about really kind of the scope of what we might expect in the coming weeks?
Josh, you want to go first, or?
Sure, I can go first. I think one of the points the committee wants to aggressively make is that January 6th did not happen in a vacuum, and that a lot of the forces that went into that are continuing to play out. You still have Stop the Steal candidates, for example, in Pennsylvania with Doug Mastriano, who now is a GOP nominee for governor there. You have folks across the country who are running on the Republican platform that the election was stolen, and in some places having success. And there are a lot of attempts that laid out before January 6th of some pretty far-flung and aggressive ideas, to seize voting machines, to have martial law, to have, the Insurrection Act, some pretty powerful and unprecedented things that allies of the former president were considering. So I think two things the committee is trying to accomplish is to show folks how unusual this was. This was not just, a politician challenging the election, and how after January 6th, a lot of has not gone away since, and it's still, key to American political life in some ways, and something that people should be paying attention to as they vote and as they pick their leaders.
Yeah, I agree with Josh. I think that there's an effort to show that even though this was a grave period, and I think that they're trying to highlight just how close it came in terms of these rioters trying to challenge Biden's electoral win. But I think that the other thing is to show that the threat still exists. I think there's been reporting in Politico and elsewhere about efforts to, connect poll workers with lawyers if they don't agree with something within like the GOP. And there's just different steps that they're trying to take to say that the threat is not over with, which is, I think, a huge emphasis for them going into these hearings, especially, I think, since the report is not coming out until September, they want to be highlighting that there's more work to be done. In addition to looking back, they want to look forward.
Yeah, just kind of an editorial comment for me is that's kind of what I'm most concerned about right now. Josh, you talked about Mastriano in Pennsylvania, but we do have Secretary of States running for office that have actually gotten the nomination for the GOP. And if those folks are in office in 2024, we might not have a Brad Raffensperger type. Brad did win at least the nom in Georgia, but that's not necessarily the case in Arizona and elsewhere. So that's definitely something worth keeping an eye on. And I'll be looking closely at how we bridge that gap from looking in the rearview mirror to looking forward to continued threats to democracy. Okay. So we also heard earlier this week that the committee has brought on former ABC News president James Goldston. My takeaway from that was that he'd be brought in to help kind of in the staging and the production quality and the imagery around the hearing. So Paul and Tara, Paul is a Democratic strategist. How do you see this playing out, and what should we expect in the way of packaging and pageantry around the hearings?
Well, first, thanks for having me, and particularly the Senator and Larry. It's amazing you get to present at a university you could have never been admitted to. So thank you. Democrats suck at storytelling. Okay, they do. I say this a lifelong Democrat as a storyteller. Democrats, when I bet you, when Dossie and Olivia's editors send them out, they say, get me a story, right? They don't say, just get me a collection of random facts and statistics. So narrative is very important. This transcends every culture. If you really want to connect with people, you have to have a hero, you have to have a villain, you have to have a victim, you have to have tension and conflict, and you have to have resolution. These are the basic elements of narrative. When I worked for President Clinton, I studied President Reagan. I didn't agree with his politics, but their stagecraft was brilliant. I got to know Mike Deaver. I studied how they told stories. So I'm very glad that the committee has brought in a professional editor, producer from TV. Now, a lot of people are diminishing that, but it's very common for committees to bring in, say, a good writer or maybe an expert on some subject matter, like the data that they're trying to plow through. So I think it's terrific. And I'll be very pleasantly surprised if the Democrats, for once, actually tell us a story. And this is potentially very compelling. I will say the most important thing is to tell a narrative. Another thing in this business, though, is expectation setting. And Jamie Raskin, who I think is a genius, is a brilliant constitutional lawyer, congressman from Maryland, a key member of this committee, he said, and I quote, "We're going to blow the roof off the Capitol." Well, first off, inapt metaphor about an insurrection where 7 people wound up losing their lives in the Capitol. But I'll give him a pass on that. You don't set the expectations that high, Congressman. They don't have to blow the roof off the Capitol. They have to do just what the journalists are telling us. Answer some basic questions. Was this a moment or a movement? Was this just spontaneous, or was it a conspiracy? Is there an ongoing threat? And if so, what do we do about it? Those kinds of things I want to know.
I think I agree with most of that. I think that I was a little taken aback, as you pointed out, about the comment about blowing the roof off the Capitol. I was like, yeah, not sure that's the sort of imagery we want to evoke right now. But again, maybe it is. So, Tara, what's your take?
Well, I happen to agree with my good friend Paul Begala and on some of this. Definitely on the part that the Democrats are terrible at messaging, and he knows it, because as opposites for many years, I would criticize Democrats for that, and Republicans are very, very good at staying on message, singing from the same sheet of music. Whether it's accurate or not, it doesn't matter. We all know in this business that repetition creates reality here, and so I'm hoping that Democrats have learned lessons from what Republicans did during Benghazi. That is the blueprint right there for A, anticipating how Republicans are going to respond, and B, to see the way Republicans conduct themselves to continually hammer home the message and staying on the same page. I worry that without that, you're going to hear competing interests from different things, and people lose focus very easily. This is a very simple story to tell. The narrative is very clear here. You had a president of the United States who, over several months, helped to incite a violent insurrection that we all sat and watched on television unfold live on TV. Besides what we saw, there are a lot of perspectives from the inside of what happened that day that the committee has done intrepid work on. And the fact that they've interviewed over 1,000 people, they've gotten even though some of the key Trump allies were unwilling to cooperate, it's clear that they had access to the staff and to documents and other pieces of information that are painting this picture and painting this narrative, which I can imagine will be extremely compelling, despite the fact that we all feel like we've seen this already or that it's not new. No, it is. And I don't think anyone would say that about 9/11. This was a domestic version of that in many respects and concerning our government. And I think it's really, really important that Democrats hammer that home, why the American people should care, and tell that narrative, because there is a villain here. There are villains, actually. And what are the consequences if accountability is not found here? And it's our democracy. And so I'm looking forward to seeing how this all plays out starting on Thursday, because if they don't hit it out of the park on Thursday, then you could lose the interest of the American people, and that would be terrible.
Well, so that's kind of I think my next question is audience wise, who's the audience for the hearings? Are there multiple audiences? And I don't know, maybe to put it a different way, is like, does this really even matter? I mean, are the media bubbles set? Are the people that listen to CNN and MSNBC already convinced of this, while Fox, as Larry pointed out, not even covering it? So how should we be thinking about the immediate impact, not the historical impact, but the immediate impact? And I'll, Tara or Paul, happy to have you chime in, and then I can also flip back to Olivia and Josh.
Tara first, and then I'll just steal all her insights.
I'll keep it brief. By the way, I had the opportunity to intern under Michael Deaver when I was at George Washington University, which was the highlight of my undergraduate experience because of the Reagan years and being able to have access to the person who was the mastermind behind all of that, which is why we were kicking your Democrats' butts for years, Paul. I'm just kidding. But anyway, so the audience, I think that the people who are watching Fox are the ones who actually need to see this the most, because they've created this bubble around them, this bubble of propaganda BS that Fox and the other right-wing ecosystem has created, where they've been able to try and rationalize this. It's Antifa, it was tourists, oh, it doesn't matter, oh, it's X, Y, and Z, because they don't want to face the truth of what happened that day and who was behind it. So the people who need to see this the most won't, unfortunately. Negative partisanship is extremely powerful, and confirmation bias is too. So they're not going to voluntarily watch this, which I think is unfortunate. It's terribly irresponsible of Fox News as a news organization not to cover this. Could you imagine if this was Watergate and ABC, NBC, or someone decided they're not covering this? I mean, it's crazy, but it's indicative of the world that we live in now. But I do think that the fact that they're doing this in prime time does demonstrate a certain gravity, a certain gravitas of this issue that will make people stop outside of the Fox News ecosystem, those folks, that will make people stop and go, well, obviously this is kind of important, so let me see if I can pay attention. It's also the summer. So I think there's a lot of challenges here keeping people engaged in this, but they're going to try. So I'm glad at least they're doing it in prime time.
So Paul, before you jump in, let me just, maybe this is the right question for you anyway, but what's the risk of backfire here, right? The overproduction quality, that strikes me that there's some downside risk.
Well, there are. I mean, I think you have to let the thing speak for itself. Let it breathe, tell the story. And the committee needs to do that. That's one big risk. I'm not that worried this can be too slick. And maybe I'm just too down on my own team in its ability to be slick. But there is always a risk of scapegoating, of being too hard, too rough. I'm old enough to remember Ollie North, who was convicted of multiple felonies, wound up a national hero because he stood up and later was convicted of lying in that testimony, overturned on appeal on a technicality. But North became a folk hero in at least among conservatives. You don't want to do that. I think the fact that the Republicans absented themselves from the committee, with the exception of Congressman Kinzinger and Congresswoman Cheney, is a huge mistake for the Republicans, huge. So the committee always has to worry about being too rough on a witness of the other party. I watched my friend Hillary testify in Benghazi for 11 hours as Trey Gowdy, Jim Jordan, a bunch of very aggressive conservative Republicans were questioning her. And I think she handled it with such aplomb that a lot of fair-minded people said, well, okay, there's just nothing here. So when you go too far, let's see if they do that. I'm not that worried about it, but let's see. There's always the risk with these things of it becoming a partisan shouting match. Again, the fact that Leader McCarthy took his members off the committee. Now, Nancy Pelosi said two of the ones he chose, Jordan and Banks, she would not seat because she was concerned they might be involved actually in the subjects or witnesses. The other three were perfectly acceptable to the speaker, but McCarthy, I think, foolishly pulled them all. So there will be two Republicans on the committee, but they're not known to be pro-Trump Republicans. And so it actually could be a very rational, reasonable. There's no one there, I think, who wants to just blow the whole thing up in the way that usually Democrats or Republicans do on these investigative committees.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, though, because they are all appointed by Speaker Pelosi, that means that if this flops, it's on them. They 100%. Cannot be scapegoating anyone but themselves.
Amen. It's a great point.
Well, and we tend to forget that McCarthy had appointed John Katko from New York to negotiate a deal, and they had reached a deal, and then it was rejected. So I think the kind of the political sequencing here will there will be journals and articles written about it, but I think we kind of lose how that all played out. So. Let's kind of close this out with this section, at least with Josh and Olivia. What has been the impact? Like, we're at a year now since the first set of hearings. What has been the impact of the long buildup to tomorrow? Has that allowed the shock to fade from January 6th? Has that given opportunity space for supporters of the former president to gaslight and diminish and say it's time to move on? That was always the message, right? Last fall. What are your thoughts on that front? And are people kind of going to that audience question? Are people just tired of this?
I was in the Capitol. I was in the House chamber during the evacuation on January 6th. And I was starting to cover House Republicans at the time. I was 3 days into a new job at Politico. And it's just to set the scene for you just how much this has changed in terms of what I was hearing, what people were telling me. In the days afterwards, I was getting phone calls from House Republicans saying, I can't believe they did this to Mike. That was the thing that really stood out to Republicans that I talked to, was how Trump turned on Mike Pence. And that they told me that it made them disgusted. They were done with Donald Trump. And as we can see, over just even a matter of a couple of months, that changed very quickly. And these same Republicans are out there on the campaign trail saying, I love Trump. I've been a supporter since day one. That's not what they were telling me on the phone. And to also just highlight how things have changed, a week after January 6th, I interviewed and did a story about the House Republicans who responded to the rioters on the House floor. And there's Mark Wayne Mellon, there's Troy Nehls, who was a freshman at the time. Nehls was telling me that if the rioters had pushed through the door of the Capitol floor, the police officers would have been in their right to shoot the rioters because they were armed with weapons. A couple months later, he's doing I guess Newsmax or OANN hit and saying that Ashley Babbitt was murdered. And I went back to him and I said, how are you squaring these two different things? And he goes, well, they were armed on one side, they weren't armed in the other. And I sent him a video and I said, they had the same exact sharpened poles. So what are you calling weapons on one side versus the other? It's just that your view has changed. It's changed for multiple Republicans who were in that scenario that I talked to. And I do believe that at one point they were listening, even if they were pretending that they weren't listening. But now with my conversations, I think that they have reached a level of fatigue where they genuinely are just saying, we want to move on. This has been plaguing us for long enough.
I guess to add to that, there were tapes released recently by Jonathan Martin and Alex Burns of their book of Kevin McCarthy in the days after January 6th, saying he was tired of Trump, basically, that he may ask him to resign. And if you remember back to that period, I think as Olivia says very astutely, that was a common mainstream position among a lot of Republicans. I mean, I remember talking to sources within the White House during that period, in the Republican conference, all over Trump world, where there was a sense that he was diminished, that he had gone way too far, that he may be impeached and convicted, or at the minimum that there was even brief talk of the 25th Amendment, right? I mean, there was no doubt, even among Republican circles during that period, what had happened and what the forces were behind it. What has changed since is, in some ways, I think it's fairly easy to understand. Back home in a lot of these members' districts, they got polling that showed voters still like Trump. I mean, there was a seminal moment where Kevin McCarthy goes to Mar-a-Lago and allows his picture to be taken with Trump within a month. And that was kind of a sign that it was okay to still be with this guy, that he was still the de facto leader of the party, that all of these forces that had tried to maybe in the early days think about taking him down or removing him. I mean, you saw Mitch McConnell, for example, out of the beginning with blistering remarks about Trump, and then later says, if he's a Republican nominee for president in 2024, I would support the nominee. I mean, there was a sense that there were a lot of folks, I think, in the Republican Party, at least according to my sourcing and a lot of the books and other people's reporting as well, who wanted that to be a moment of ending for Trump, but they realized that they could not topple him. So what you've seen since, I think, is a revisionism on a lot of fronts of what happened that day, some with success and some not, and a lot of folks trying to figure out how to fall back in line with this guy who remains the most influential figure in the Republican Party.
Yeah, and I think that's That's at least what I'm still trying to figure out is, what is the scope of that influence? I mean, I've seen different polling that suggests that it's waning, and some of the choices through the primaries have shown that his grip is relenting somewhat, but in other bastions, Pennsylvania, for instance, it seems as strong as ever. So let's kind of get back into the strategy piece a little bit. So last week, Axios reported that supporters of the former president, including current members of Congress and members of the media, will ramp up a counter-programming campaign during the hearing. So, there may, in fact, actually be some indications that that campaign has already started. And, there's been a noticeable uptick and seemingly a coordinated campaign to really highlight the headwinds facing the current administration. So Tara, maybe you're the former GOP communications person. So what would a counter programming campaign even look like right now? And again, given those media and information ecosystems that we always talk about, can this be effective?
Well, it'll be effective with the people who are already sour on the administration, and some of the. I mean, it's unfortunate that the headwinds that the Biden administration is facing, these, some of their own making, a lot of them not, but the buck stops with the president, so they take the brunt of it. So it gives the Republicans plenty of fodder to use in their messaging to counter program what's happening. First of all, the first thing you learn in debate 101 is when you're losing the argument, substitute the issue. So there is really no defense of what the president did and his acolytes and what happened on January 6th. There's no defense for this. And like I said, we all saw it. It's very heavily documented. So instead of facing that, taking responsibility and moving forward the way that they did the days right after, the day of and the days immediately in the aftermath of January 6th, where Republicans were actually honest with themselves and spoke plainly about what happened. They're back in campaign mode. So they're trying to hold on to their jobs, and their constituents have been inundated and indoctrinated with this, that January 6th was, just a handful of people. It wasn't a big deal. And in some circles, they justified it, that it was actually a justifiable act because the election had been stolen, which you all know is a lie. So what they're going to do, and we've already seen a preview of this, is they're going to focus on the kitchen table issues that are impacting everyday Americans, right? Gas prices are through the roof, record levels, inflation. We now also see caravans again. The go-to, which is immigration, the fear of the other that Republicans love to use. And oh my gosh, they're coming to invade our community again. And unfortunately, those messages work in those circles. Crime. These are all real life issues that are going on that Republicans will exploit to the nth degree in order to keep everyone looking over here versus what's going on in the committee, because it's so damning for them that there really is no defense. You're also going to see, and there's been reporting on this, that they're going to turn around and try to blame Nancy Pelosi and failures with Capitol security on the speaker. Which is absurd. It had nothing to do with the Speaker of the House, but that's something else that you're going to hear, because the images of what happened to those police officers and the law enforcement officers who were defending the Capitol that day is so horrific. And it's counter to the back the blue and the pro law enforcement rah-rah that Republicans often portray, but apparently not those officers. And we've heard them try to disparage their credibility and their integrity, which I also think is despicable. But it's part of their strategy, is to try to discredit those officers and to go after Nancy Pelosi, who's always the boogeyman when they need to. It's either Nancy Pelosi or Hillary Clinton. So they couldn't blame Clinton for this one. So you're going to hear some Pelosi blaming as well, because that's their go-to strategy. We're already starting to see it.
Yeah, I think that claim that Pelosi is responsible, I always found that particularly irritating and specious at best. I mean, it's a shared responsibility across the Speaker of the House, the Majority Leader of the Senate, and the architect of the Capitol. And I keep in mind that on January 5th or 6th, the the Senate Majority Leader was still Mitch McConnell. The results in Georgia had not tilted the balance of power, nor had the power sharing agreement been sorted out. And that took another week or so. So I think I agree with you, and it kind of comes back to the popular refrain of just it's the economy, stupid, and that's the areas they could focus on. And I think there's also probably some risk. As particularly after the hearings this morning, the powerful hearings this morning on gun control, or at least gun-related legislation, there seems to be some momentum, and I do wonder that if the timing, and sometimes you can't control these things, of course, but is there some downside risk to other important legislative initiatives? So, Paul, just asking for your thoughts, whether responding to Tara or just independent.
Well, I think Tara sketches out exactly what's likely to happen, although I will add one other thing. Changing the subject is always the best thing to do when you're losing. Tara's right, that I'm an old high school debater. There's another subject we haven't mentioned, abortion. Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization is done. It is sitting in Chief Justice or Justice Alito's or Justice Thomas's laptop, right? They're going to hit, I hope I'm wrong, but I'm not. I bet you a nickel they hit send on that opinion either Thursday afternoon to interrupt the coverage of the hearing, which is unlikely. They generally don't do that. They generally announce them 10 a.m. on Friday. So Friday morning, 10 a.m., you hide and watch. I have never lost money betting against the integrity of the Republicans on the Supreme Court. I'm sorry, but it is a rigged deal. They are bigger hacks. They're such hacks over there. They make me look like Oliver Wendell Holmes. So that's a whole nother way to change the subject. And that doesn't even require Kevin McCarthy to do anything. That opinion is coming. It may preserve Roe for all I know, but it's certainly from the leaks that Olivia's publication put out, it looks like Justice Alito has at least 5 votes to overturn Roe. And I think they're going to do it. And if you're going to do it anyway, why not do it at the maximum moment to hurt Democrats and help Trump? So I think we all, you journalists ought to be like sharpening your pencils and loading up on coffee, because having filed your story on the hearing, you're going to get a holy smokes text. See how I clean that up, Larry? A holy smokes text from your editor saying the opinion's coming out.
And the other thing is Trump announcing he's going to run for president. That'll be in July. So they're going to let the abortion thing go in June, and then in July, mark my words, that Trump will announce. We're starting to hear rumors of that anyway.
Yeah, I mean, so the Trump issue is one thing, right? And I think that's probably more emotional and probably wanted to again change the subject. I think, Paul, your point about Dobbs is that, well, that certainly took this conversation in a different turn.
Just stirring the pot, Chris. I have no inside knowledge.
It's still early. I'm in San Francisco, so it's still early in San Francisco, and that's certainly the most cynical thing I've heard yet today. But
welcome to politics, Chris.
I think what I'll say about that is, like, there's certainly something to say about expecting the unexpected, and what is the most, not a black swan event, because we've seen the draft, allegedly at least, but that would certainly be a game changer for sure. So Josh and Olivia, I mean, that's a pretty strong suggestion, or at least a kind of a scenario, at least. Any thoughts?
I'll let Olivia take that one first.
We can move on. Okay. So let's kind of, again, let's try to get this back on track here. So, a lot of the staging of the hearings, and I think, Josh, you already said it about the way that this is very similar to an opening argument, perhaps, of kind of setting the stage. Let's kind of talk. We've got a Thursday hearing. You've talked about primetime and non-primetime hearings. Is the cake baked here? Do we really think that the trajectory of the hearings is set? We've got a solid plan, or is there perhaps there's a weather vane that'll dictate subsequent hearings, and even the final report is malleable given what the reactions may be. And Terry, you've done a bit of this, of course, but is this a bit of a focus group effort as well, and kind of just doing good populist politics here? You feed off, you see what resonates, and you focus on that going forward. Josh and Olivia.
Well, you have a lot of wrangling with witnesses still that the committee's doing. You still have them trying to get folks to see who will testify, who will not. You still have courts ruling on what emails they're going to put out and what not. For example, with John Eastman, one of the Trump lawyers, you still see fights, with various folks over providing materials. I mean, you have the RNC, for example, that has, taken the committee to court. You have lots of different figures in Trump's orbit who have been resistant to testifying voluntarily and have gone to court. So you don't really know exactly what you have. I mean, what I think the committee does have, right, is a number of figures, let's say, from former Vice President Pence's orbit. We have DOJ figures who got pressure at the time from former President Trump who cooperated. They have mid and junior level aides in the White House. They have Secret Service folks. They have folks inside the Capitol Police. They have folks in various components of the government where you can imagine they can put together a pretty comprehensive report, if not have everything. All of that said, is a cake baked at this time. There's been some recent polling that's shown that the number of people who think the former president was responsible for this has actually gone down a little bit over the past year, at least as the main figure who's responsible in the various efforts to kind of change the narrative of what happened on that day. And you have, a lot of folks who've decided, particularly on the Republican side, that it was not that big of a deal through the past 18 months or so. So the committee will have a challenge, I think, of convincing folks that they should pay attention to this extensively, that what they're seeing and hearing from these folks, it's worth taking 15, 20 hours over the next few weeks and listening, or at least in the primetime hearings, listening to some of it. And that, these are incontrovertible facts that they're trying to present from people who were on the ground and inside and involved that day. And they hope that they can break through to some people, that there are people who will tune in and see things that surprise them and illuminate them, that are revelatory to them. But I don't know that that's a safe bet in this polarized political climate. I'd be curious to hear what Olivia has to say about this too. But I'm not sure that it's a safe bet that they can convert a lot of people to seeing the world the way they want them to see it.
Yeah. Olivia, any parting shot?
Thanks. One thing that I was thinking about is when these hearings begin, a lot of unpredictable things can start to happen. They're going to have to be both looking at what the right is doing, but also if you look back at the first impeachment, when some of those hearings started happening, they actually had more people coming forward and saying, okay, I'm going to speak about this. And I think one of the names that ended up joining the testimony was David Holmes. And so that could happen here if they start showing this information, saying, okay, that person spoke and shared this, I can add X, Y, Z. They're going to keep building information. As to how many, hearings they do, I think they're going to want to end while they're on top. And one thing that we've sort of been hearing from our sources is that they don't want this to be like the Russia probe when Robert Mueller put out his report and it seemed to have all this buildup and then fall flat, sort of like Paul was talking about, setting expectations. They want it to be digestible. They don't want it to be full of legalese. They want everyday people just to understand what they're trying to relay. And so in that way, that's what they're sort of aiming with. But, there's things that they're not going to be able to control. They can control who comes into the room, but they also can't control what's said. I think they're going for witnesses that are going to be working with them, but they're approaching a different page in their investigation.
And I think that's a great segue. I mean, I've been thinking a lot about witnesses and the content they're going to produce and present between audio clips, video clips, transcripts read aloud. But, there's something to be said about the real power of an in-person witness and seeing it happen live. When you think back even to the Sussman court case recently, I think one of the real, at least one of the takeaways, at least that stuck with me, was Robbie Mook saying that, the former First Lady and Secretary had at least reviewed it. Now, not to debate that issue, but, look, Sussman ultimately was acquitted, but that's the narrative that the right has continued to play, that this was that Russiagate was really a Hillary Clinton operation, which is, of course, not actually anything about what actually happened. So let's talk about witnesses. What should we be expecting from witnesses? Is there, would we expect any hostile witnesses, a John Eastman type or a Peter Navarro even, or should it really be a sympathetic, aligned, or, at worst, and kind of an independent take? And Paul or Tara, start with you.
Well, if I were, of course, Navarro now is facing indictment, but if I were advising those folks, I'd send them up there. Like I said, look at Ollie North. I mean, a confrontational witness against a congressional committee actually has all the advantages. The committee is literally stacked above you, and most people adopt the point of view of the witness. But I don't know that they're going to do it. I think they've made a big mistake in refusing to testify. I mean that. I'm not being cynical. I think it's a mistake. I think, as I said, I couldn't get into UVA. The University of Texas, where I did go, there is a line of sacred scripture carved in stone at the main building, and it's John 8:32. Ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. So when they don't testify, it makes me think, ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall scare the pants off you. So I think they would do well to go ahead and to testify, but they're not going to. That said, the documents and the data can tell the story. And it's not as dramatic, Chris. You're exactly right. There's nothing like John Dean in Watergate turning on Nixon and telling the truth. That's really compelling, and you may get some of that. I have no idea. But even if we can't get Mr. Bannon's testimony or Mr. Navarro's testimony or Mr. Meadows' testimony, I bet you the committee has documents, texts, emails from them that are incontrovertible. And I think Josh will tell you this. This is a shocking thing, but sometimes people don't remember things accurately when they're talking to you. But if having been through one impeachment and multiple federal and congressional investigations, I always was more interested in the documents because you can't change them after the fact. Memories sometimes change.
Yeah, I think your narrative laundering point sticks home, and I think there's probably going to be a whole bunch of that as a part of that counter program. So, Tara, your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think that they're trying to avoid a circus because of lessons learned in the past, and we've seen that most of these witnesses, the ones who have refused to testify, they've been hostile. Or, the Peter Navarro example is a great one because he's gone out there and done media interviews, and it's turned into an absolute circus. So much so that the Justice Department is warned, the court that, Peter Navarro, don't make a mockery of our court with your behavior in the media. So you have a lot of these cast of characters here that don't exactly comport themselves in a way that most of us would find respectful of the process. And so the way the committee is conducting this, they are controlling it so that they don't have that type of kabuki theater. And that's why Nancy Pelosi refused to seat some of those members of Congress as well that McCarthy wanted, like Jim Jordan and others, because that's their brand. They're more interested in fundraising and getting Fox News hits or OANN hits to show how they own the libs or whatever, as opposed to getting to the bottom of it and actually living up to their oath of office, getting to the bottom of a violent insurrection that attacked our Capitol and our democracy that day. So I think that the witnesses, what you see, it's all going to be very, very controlled for those reasons.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think at this point, we're going to bring Larry back in and we can talk kind of about forward-looking pieces. We touched on that early on, but what's both the historical significance and what do we think a final product, right? It's the semester at UVA just wrapped up and everybody turned in their final exams and final papers. Same sort of thing. What do we think the range of actions that the committee could take as it expires perhaps in the fall? What does a final report look like? How does this sequence with the Department of Justice? We talked about Navarro. I mentioned earlier the seditious conspiracy indictments of Proud Boy members, and there are, of course, others. And, I think Garland, the Attorney General, has gotten a significant amount of criticism over the last year and a half for perhaps not moving fast enough. And we're seeing some of the cases, some of the indictments and the grand juries being unveiled. At the same time, we right now have a grand jury impaneled in Fulton County, Georgia, of the interference there. And, so how do we think this all moves forward beyond the committee? Is this, let's hold the kind of historical piece to close, but for now, what do we think the forks in the road ahead of us are? And Larry, we'll start with you.
Well, Chris, you're right to point to potential indictments and trials and criminal penalties. I know at least the Democratic side of the ledger has been waiting for Merrick Garland, the Attorney General, and the DOJ to take some action. And naturally, they focus on Trump, but they also focus on plenty of others. Will there be something presented that adds to the case that DOJ will consider? I wish I knew, but we're all going to find out together. I'll tell you one thing that's really important, though, Chris. People should not judge these hearings based on whether they're converting millions of people to care about the issue. We live in a hyper-polarized era, a very partisan era. You are not going to change people's minds. And most Republicans, or certainly most Trump supporters, aren't going to watch 10 minutes of these hearings. So they have no chance to get new information to be converted to some particular point of view. And the fact that Fox is an area, yes, they're going on Fox Business, which has 150,000 viewers compared to millions for the Fox News Network. That is simply a big piece of this. It's very difficult to get a message out to them without Fox covering it. So I don't want the hearings judged on that. And I'm going to be very upset at the media pundits, Paul, Tara, others. Josh writes, so I'm not going to get after him. Olivia writes. But this is the wrong standard. We're looking at what happened and why, and not just what happened on January 6th. To me, the most important part of this is in finding out what the plot was all along. When did it develop? Probably after the election, but probably within a few days. That's my personal guess. I don't know. I want to see what evidence they present. Who was involved in that part of the plot? That was the silent plot, and it was a plot. No question about this. It was an attempted coup, and the people who were involved in this attempted coup, at the very least, need to be exposed. I'd like to see more than that, but I'll be grateful if the committee exposes all of them.
Yeah. So, Josh, any parting shot from you since Larry invoked your name?
Well, I think what is incumbent upon all of us during the committee is to look at what they've actually found. They have something that a lot of journalists don't have, which is subpoena power. They can force the National Archives to give over documents. They can force, various agencies, various lawyers, various outside folks to give over documents. And with a lot of that comes, responsibility to be able to show documentary evidence. I mean, I agree with what Paul said earlier, that as a journalist, one of the things you like to see when you're going back and putting together an event like this is what were people saying contemporaneously in live time and text messages and documents. I mean, that's one of the most illuminating things the committee has put out so far, I think, is a series of text messages from Mark Meadows that show, all of the various figures. The chief of staff was talking to some fringe figures, some outside lawyers, all sorts of folks during that lead up to that period. And if the committee provides extensive documents and evidence, it shows things that are compelling, right? I mean, and our industry, I think it's always best, like when you show, don't tell, right? You show the reader, right, what the new proof is, what the evidence is, what's going on, and it's not just opinion. And I'll be curious to see how much more showing the committee can do of real hard evidence.
Yeah, I think a good bit about that, what you're putting in the record. But we also mentioned the narrative laundering. We've also seen a number of former officials in the last administration. They've had emails and text messages publicly revealed, and yet they seem to have somehow been redeemed, and whatever redemption looks like in the eyes of the former president, they've been able to accomplish that. So, all right, let's close this out then with some thoughts about the historical significance of these hearings. I mean, we've talked about a range. Paul, you invoked the Benghazi hearings, and there's Watergate before. How should we be thinking about the historical significance of these hearings. And, I'll even add it, the final report is the final report also, should that be, should we be thinking about that, viewing that, assuming they land the plane the right way, as a bit of a seminal moment in the forward movement of American democracy. So Paul, start with you.
Yeah, first, thanks, Chris. I think that's the right way to kind of frame this up and close it out. Again, if I were advising them, write this report for history, not politics. I really believe this, and I hope I'm not being too alarmist. There is a potential existential threat to American democracy. Not because this party wins or that party wins, but if a large segment of our country stops believing that we, the people, can fairly and honestly choose our leaders, that's elemental, that's existential. And so when some people took up arms to stop that peaceful transfer of power, I think we need to know about it. And so I really do think when they're producing their final report, they need to elevate this as far as they can. Don't worry about moving persuadable voters, or Larry's right, you're not going to budge very many Trump voters. But in history, we still remember Senator Howard Baker of Tennessee asking this famous 11-word question: what did the president know and when did he know it? About Watergate. What was Nixon doing? Not what were these, nutty former CIA people doing breaking into a hotel or an office building. I think Liz Cheney, the vice chair of the committee, pretty solid Republican if you ask me, Congresswoman Cheney asked this question: did Donald Trump, through action or inaction, corruptly seek to obstruct or impede Congress's official proceedings to count electoral votes? Now, she didn't pull that language from the wind. It's not as tight and poetic and simple as Howard Baker's, but that's 18 U.S. Code 1512. That's a federal offense. And what she is getting at is she wants to know the answer to the question: did the person sworn to faithfully execute the laws actually participate in a movement to stop the execution of those laws? If you impede Congress from counting the electoral votes, you've negated the votes of 185 million of us. And that's the thing, that's who the victim is here. It's not Joe Biden or Kamala Harris or Donald Trump. And I think the broader that the committee is about this, the better. And that will be the question that's a very high bar. Accuse the President of the United States of potentially, she didn't accuse him, but of asking the question. So they've set a very, very high bar. I think they have to set even higher for their report, which is right for history, not for news.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I've, the bar for the court of public opinion certainly is much lower than a court of law. And I think what we've seen historically is the former president has managed to, whether through skill or just luck, always just come right under that threshold. So Tara, your thoughts?
I echo Paul's thoughts on that they need to take history into account when they approach this, and not politics, because it's anytime you have a failed coup without consequence, it's simply a practice run. And we cannot allow our democracy to be held hostage by this threat, which is very, very real. And if they do not take that into account moving forward, then I think this just gets swept under the rug as another political partisan commission. And we don't learn as a country, we don't learn the lessons we're supposed to learn. And history doesn't judge kindly when things like that happen. So I don't think that that's how they will approach this, given the makeup of this committee. These are very serious people that do understand this moment in history and do understand the gravity of this and the existential threat that is posed to our democracy now. So I am confident that they are going to write a stellar report, and it really needs to be similar to the 9/11 Commission, the Warren Commission reports. That is how serious this incident is. It was unprecedented what happened on January 6th. When I made the 9/11 reference, it was in reference to the moment in history, the seriousness of the attack, where everyone stops and remembers exactly where they were when it happened. These are inflection points in our country, and I think that the serious people who are on this committee understand that, and they will take all of this into consideration as they formulate not only the approach to the hearings, but to the final report. And history will be the judge.
Yeah, I find your point about the practice run. I've used that line, or something like calling it a mulligan or something like that. What concerns me the most is that we fixate on what happened in the past and look forward expecting to see the same thing. And look, we have intelligent, in this case, intelligent adversaries that learn from the mistake. They take feedback, they can observe, and they can improve. They will not make similar mistakes going forward. And so we have to, keep in mind that this is an evolving threat to democracy. So Larry, I'll tip it back over to you to bring us home and where you think, as of course, a historian and political historian at that, where do you see this fitting into the American democracy, the tapestry of democracy here?
It's a critical question, Chris, and I hope people will think a little bit about that. Certainly the committee should. I'm glad to hear the other panelists, and the panel has been fantastic with a magnificent moderator, I might add. You all have done a great job, and I hope people are watching and getting the sense of this. But what everybody needs to remember, whether this rises to the level of criminality or not, is that what happened January 6th and before January 6th is absolutely unprecedented in American history. Look, I studied the presidency for a long time. I've read a lot of biographies about individual presidents. Some I wish I hadn't read, but nonetheless, we've had some real third-raters in the White House. We've had even a few villains. And yes, we've had some great presidents at just the right time, too. But what people need to remember always is that no president has ever attempted what Donald Trump did on January 6th and before that. There was one other attempted coup, of course, and that was against Abraham Lincoln. He clearly wasn't involved since he was assassinated, but you had a conspiracy group plotting to take him down. They almost killed the Secretary of State. They were going to kill the Vice President and so on. That is the only other case of an attempted coup, which narrowly failed and cost us Lincoln. This itself is something that will always be remembered, should be remembered, must be written into the history books, and not just history, right now, and through 2024 at least. We need to focus on what this committee is saying and what we're going to learn from it. And I simply want to thank all of you for a fantastic job. I think the people watching this are better prepared for these hearings than almost everybody else. So I just thank you all. Thank you, Chris. Thank you to our superb panelists. And I guess a final note, Paul, if you had applied to the University of Virginia, not only would you have gotten in, I personally would have argued for a full scholarship. So on that note.
Yeah.
Thank you, Larry.
Thanks, Larry, for the closing remarks. I will point out that you seem to have overlooked the business plot of 1933 and Smedley Butler's efforts to overthrow FDR. So
I did. You're right. I did overlook that.
That one's a lot of fun to read. I mean, and it kind of reminds you of perhaps some of the background and competence of the fortunate background and competence of the current group. We've seen this gang that can't shoot straight once before. So again, what a fantastic panel, great participation, and I suspect you will hear in the coming days and weeks from all of today's panelists. But just a reminder, as Larry pointed out, hopefully you're a little bit better equipped, more informed to process and understand where the hearings are going. But ultimately, as Larry pointed out, ultimately this is democracy on the line, and something that even I said back in 2020 as we were prepping for the 2020 election is that the last line of defense for American democracy is the American voter. And so take this information, use it to make your decisions going forward in 22 and 24. Don't wait for the courts to sort everything out. You have power at the ballot box. So with that, I'll send everybody on their way and have a very good evening. Thank you.